it's really profitable to do these hospital discharges with stretches, and more NEMT businesses are doing that.
If you fill your schedule with ththose routine rides that are reimbursed at low rates, are you shortchanging yourself the opportunity to take more on-demand transports that would be paid at higher rates? And that's always, the $1 million question.
Welcome back to NEMT Experts. I've got Sam Farmer with me, who is the CEO of Roundtrip, which is a new age tech-enabled broker. It's a ride ordering system for facilities and organizations to basically streamline ride ordering directly to transportation providers. Sam, thanks for being with me. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I want to dive right into your background and how you got into this industry of medical transportation and Roundtrip and becoming the CEO of the company.
Yeah, totally. So I'm actually, by training, I'm an engineer, and very quickly realized that that was probably not my calling in life. And so I started out my career in consulting, and I joke often that healthcare chose me. So, I finished college, I got my first consulting job. I got put on a project for one of the largest Blues plans in the country. And all of a sudden, overnight, I was now a healthcare person, and I was a business intelligence person and a data warehousing person. And as it turns out, I've never been able to untangle myself from that. So I spent the majority of the start of my career working in across all sectors of healthcare, primarily within healthcare technology, but every function within the company, onshore, offshore, you name it. And then, through my network, got introduced to Roundtrip and had the opportunity to join the company after they raised their Series A back in 2019. Joined in an operations role, was COO for a number of years. And then as we've kind of grown and scaled and stabilized, I stepped into the CEO role about a year ago. So I joined the company with no specific NEMT experience. And candidly, I was actually really concerned when I joined that I would get bored, that it's such a very specific niche of healthcare. I was like, this is not going to be as interesting as my consulting days. And it's now 5.5 years later, there is no boredom in sight. So I was really wrong on that front.
Yep. I certainly never get bored in this industry either, for better or worse.
Yeah.
The term broker comes in a variety of flavors and formats. Roundtrip, yes, is a broker, but not in the typical sense. Sam, can you sort of explain us where Roundtrip sort of fits into the industry?
Totally. Yeah. So I think, in healthcare and in NEMT specifically, when people see, say or hear the word broker, oftentimes what they're thinking of is there's a handful of really big legacy names in NEMT brokerage who have, certain particular models for how they operate. It tends to be a really kind of call center based process. These are big organizations. They're building these large networks of transportation companies and handling a lot of stuff by phone call, negotiating rates with them in a way that fits into the types of contracts that these brokers have agreed to. And I think in most cases, people think of these brokers as being, the vendor of choice for a Medicare or a Medicaid, offering. And so from a Roundtrip perspective, we're really working primarily with hospitals, health systems, the healthcare provider space. So if you think about a care coordinator discharging a patient or an emergency department transferring a patient to another level of care, how are they engaging with and ordering transportation? And so what we do is we build this tech platform that is that single pane of glass that these folks that are on kind of that clinical side can order any level of transportation for any payer type, whether it's pre-scheduled or more on demand, to get patients moved, where they need to. And so what we're really moving the needle on with most of our customers is metrics like patient flow, ED hold times, length of stay, the amount of patients who leave an emergency room without being seen because the wait times are long, those sorts of things. And so at the end of the day, we don't own vehicles, we don't employ drivers. And so by the textbook definition, we are a broker of transportation services, but definitely a different position in the market, and a different dynamic in the way that we relate to transport companies.
Awesome. So I know that you guys, one of the things you focus a lot on is hospital discharges, right? Like on demand, a facility needs to get a patient out of their facility. They'll call up or use Roundtrip to order a ride to a medical transportation business. And one of the reasons this is so interesting in the world of NEMT is that a lot of the times it'll be to an ambulance company, right? Like, hey, hospital discharge, ambulance company, get this patient out of here. But ambulance companies, they charge a lot. And I know at Bambi, we have customers that do NEMT and they're doing stretcher trips, and they just focus on hospital discharges because they know, hey, you know what? We charge way less than an ambulance company would, and we're just doing stretcher trips as NEMT. The hospital wins because they're paying us. We win because these hospital discharges pay a lot more than other kinds of NEMT trips. And Roundtrip, I mean, you guys are sort of streamlining facilities to be able to send those rides to ambulance companies and NEMT companies. Sam, can you just talk about sort of like the whole hospital discharge situation and, sort of routine sort of trips like your dialysis versus discharges and the way that's going in the industry?
Totally. So if you think about, you mentioned routine trips, you think about, I think probably the best example you brought up is dialysis, right? Unfortunately, there are tons of patients around the country who need dialysis 3 times a week. And despite the fact that there is at-home dialysis in the US, it's really not well adopted. And so these are patients that are typically not able to get themselves around, or they're not in a great health condition. And so they need that routine transport. From a transportation provider perspective, that type of routine transport can be a big benefit because you can fill your schedule with kind of known stuff, right? It's less unpredictable. You've got a sense of kind of, if you're a company that likes to project revenues and how things are going, like it feels really good to have that solid base of routine transport. On the flip side, if you think about hospital discharges, even though the majority of patients who enter a hospital will need to be discharged from a hospital, the transportation planning for that discharge tends to be something that isn't coordinated far in advance. And in some cases, it's because they don't actually know where the patient is discharging to, whether they're going home or whether they're going to a SNF, which SNF, if there's a bed, there's all these factors that come into play. And so what we see on the hospital side is most of these inpatient discharges are being requested with maybe 3 hours of lead time. And so it becomes really this on-demand type of request that's coming into NEMT companies. And whether it's, a patient who's ambulatory but just doesn't have a ride, or a patient that truly needs monitoring and needs a higher level of ambulance service, and they're going to a long-term acute care or something, you get this kind of large amount of volume coming out of the provider space that you don't have the lead time on. And then from an NEMT company perspective, you have to figure out how to fit that, or if you want to fit that into your schedule around those routine appointments.
Okay, so I mean, this brings us into the topic of AI scheduling and dispatch, right? Like, how are NEMT businesses or ambulance companies finding ways to fit in pretty unpredictable trips, right? Hospital discharges can pop up anytime. Like, how do they manage? Okay, do we have capacity to fit in this trip on this vehicle, which may be over here? Because a lot of NEMT is scheduled in advance. A lot of it is routine. How are you finding the businesses that Roundtrip, sends rides to for hospital discharges? How are they managing actually being able to accept those rides and fulfill them?
Yeah, I'd say it varies by transportation level, right? So at the ambulance level, what we find is those transportation providers tend to be better suited to shorter lead times, less notice. If they do have routine stuff like a complex patient that needs ambulance transport for a dialysis treatment or something, they tend to schedule those transports in the morning because in most cases, hospital discharges really start to back up in the afternoon. And so they're starting to weight their schedules in a way that says, how do I reserve as much capacity as possible in the afternoon? But then the afternoon comes around and you're getting just totally hammered with requests. When we look at the lower levels of transportation, so the stretcher van, the wheelchair, that sort of stuff, we run into a lot of transportation providers who say things like, I need 24 hours of notice to schedule transport. And we're like, that's not how discharges work. And so finding a group of transportation providers that's willing to kind of work on those shorter timelines with a facility can be tricky. And that's what I think is pretty exciting about the AI scheduling opportunities that we're seeing emerge in the dispatch space is, in some cases, these lower level transport companies in the NEMT space tend to be smaller operations. They might be an owner who's also the dispatcher, or they might have kind of outsourced dispatch or folks who aren't watching. They're not 24-hour operations in most cases. And so the ability to receive a request and actually evaluate how it might fit into a schedule when it relies solely on a human ends up, I think, in a lot of cases, leaving patients moving more slowly, and potentially with transportation providers leaving, volume on the table because they haven't kind of tuned their operations around it. And so letting those AI scheduling assistants step in and say, hey, like, here's the request. We understand it. We understand the traffic environment and all those things. Let's see how we can make it work is a huge benefit, I think, across the board.
Yeah. I, of course, have my own thoughts on AI scheduling. But I mean, Sam, what are your thoughts on like the adoption of AI scheduling by actual medical transport businesses? Like, is it increasing at the pace that you would expect? I mean, why is there pushback from greater adoption, do you think?
So what we've seen, one, it's not available on every dispatch platform. So that's one component. I think the tech is lagging on some platforms. In places where it is available, what we've seen is there's this like mistrust almost that an AI can do it as well, or gasp, even better than a human previously was. And so there's this tendency we've seen with some dispatchers, and some people are excited and adopt it, right? But we've seen also some dispatchers who are like, no, like, I know the system, I know the process, I know what to look for, like, I am the expert here. And I think in some cases there are dispatchers who are just really well tuned to their jobs. But we've seen some folks say, yeah, it exists, but I just don't really trust it. And I'm not sure how to build that trust. What are you guys seeing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't blame them, because if they haven't used a system that actually works well, then yeah, why would they trust any new system that say, no, we actually do work and we work really well, right? So when we show people Bambi and we show it to them, then it works. Like, then they start to come around. And then when we show lots of testimonials of other people who are using AI scheduling, that's what moves the needle for people, which I totally get. I mean, I would be doing the same thing if I were in those shoes. But I want to move on to the money flow in this industry. So different payers, upstream, there's Medicaid payers, there's Medicare, there's facilities. What do NEMT businesses need to think about when accepting certain kinds of trips or going after certain kinds of work, in terms of how much money am I making based on who's paying for it?
Totally. And I think it varies largely by market. It varies by the way that they've negotiated or failed to negotiate, in some cases, different contracts. What we see coming from, the provider, the health system side, is in general, there's a lot of interest in using a product like Roundtrip to streamline the ride ordering when the payer mix is largely Medicaid. Because in most cases, to coordinate Medicaid transports, you've got folks on your team sitting on the phone with those kind of traditional NEMT brokers, trying to get a ride authorized and get it assigned and all that stuff. And that is a time suck in itself. And then when we work with our transportation partners to make sure that we've got a good, solid network to support those health systems, the things that they're always looking for are, hey, I've got decent rates with the local Medicaid folks, but if it's more than X% of my business, the math doesn't work. And so the transportation partners that we work with are always thinking about what that ideal payer mix is and how they kind of optimize that. And so the requests that come through Roundtrip will obviously show who the payer is and what's going on. And I think there's the balance of, you can't cherry pick only all of the best payers, only the facility paid rides, only those scenarios. There's a level of kind of that calculus of, what do I need to take to be a good partner and continue to maintain this relationship and this source of volume, while also making sure that I'm balancing business appropriately. I think for the NEMT space that's non-ambulance, it becomes even trickier because traditional Medicare doesn't cover any of those types of transports. And so what you end up with, I think, is a payer mix that's either facility pay, patient pay, or Medicaid. And in many markets, the Medicaid rates for those types of transport are really almost prohibitively low, to the point that you have to have a really steady volume of facility pay or patient pay transports to just make all the financials work. And so it's nice that we're able to work with our hospital partners to educate them and say, hey, you can move a patient faster in the appropriate level of transportation via a facility pay or patient pay method. This will build your relationship with these, transport providers who maybe are less flexible to on-demand transports. And everybody wins in this scenario. And you mentioned ambulances being so much more expensive than a stretcher van. Something we do is we help people book their transports is we walk them through truly what is medical necessity, right? So if a patient is ambulatory, they might just need a medical sedan. If a patient, is bedbound but doesn't need any type of monitoring, you don't need to put them in an ambulance. You could put them in a stretcher van. And it's kind of this whole, we see so many places that the muscle memory is to overorder, just put everyone in a BLS ambulance. And that has its own issues. So making sure that every hospital we work with understands the payer dynamics and what's covered and what's not covered, and the levers that they have to pull to move patients quickly and to build and maintain strong relationships with the transportation providers in their network.
And so what does that mean from an NEMT business's perspective about this kind of payer mix? How do they optimize for this situation?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I've seen, and you're probably closer to how some of these folks are constructing their businesses, but I've seen, a lot of NEMT businesses build their schedules around those Medicaid rides, those routine rides, because the routine foundation is comforting to build a business on. But if you fill your schedule with those routine rides that are reimbursed at low rates, are you shortchanging yourself the opportunity to take more on-demand transports that would be paid at higher rates? And that's always, the $1 million question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know we have some savvy customers who said, forget all the routine trips. We have one customer, it's a 15 vehicle NEMT business, not ambulance, NEMT. They're 100% stretcher vans, and close to 100% of what they do is just hospital discharges.
Yep.
But I don't find that common in the NEMT space. And I'm curious to get your thoughts. In the world of hospital discharges, do you see more and more pure NEMT, not ambulance, but pure NEMT companies encroaching on that space and finding, hey, it's really profitable to do these hospital discharges with stretchers, and more NEMT businesses are doing that?
So I think it really varies market by market. So something that we've seen that I think is pretty interesting is different states have different requirements on the EMT side of things. And I swear I'm going to tie this back to NEMT. But on the EMT side of things, there are states that have what's called a certificate of necessity. And think of that as almost like the equivalent of a taxi medallion for ambulances. And so not any ambulance company can spring up. You can't have a bunch of them that pop up out of nowhere. what tends to happen in these markets is there's a lot of consolidation. And so while there may have initially been 15 ambulance companies that had certificates of necessity, through mergers and acquisitions, it ends up being 2. And it ends up being actually quite competitive to get ambulance transports in those markets. And what I've seen in those markets is people stop using ambulance almost altogether if they can help it, and move every single patient in a stretcher van because it's not subject to those same certificate of necessity requirements. And so it ends up being this really cost-effective and much more available form of patient transportation. And so my guidelines would be, it depends on where you are, what market you're in. And so if you know that ambulances are certificate of necessity in your market, there is huge opportunity for structure van companies to step in and say, we can do the vast majority of your transports. But the payment and reimbursement is going to look a little bit different. You can't put those through Medicare, but if you're paying out of pocket for them, it's going to be, multiples cheaper.
Sam, being in this industry at Roundtrip for 5.5 years, I'm sure that you have collected a ton of interesting and colorful stories of NEMT businesses dealing with hospitals. And I'd love for you to just share some sort of success stories or interesting stories of NEMT businesses figuring out the system and actually, becoming really profitable and doing well.
Yeah. Man, you kind of put me on the spot there. So I think there are situations where there are hospitals that are located in well-populated, urban or suburban centers where it seems like a place that makes sense to build a business and say, hey, there's a lot of healthcare here. There's a lot going on. And what we find in general is like the markets can be really competitive there. And so some of the neatest success stories that I can think of is we work with a health plan in Washington, and their members are spread across the whole state of Washington. I'm not great at geography, but I've gotten much better at Washington geography since we've worked with this customer. And there's not a whole lot going on in a lot of Washington. But there's still patients there who need transportation for things. And so we've seen these opportunities where if you create the connections and you create the right agreements and you manage expectations and understand truly how it is that transportation providers are operating and what those economics look like, you can create a situation where everybody wins, right? So rather than nickel and diming and saying, hey, I need to get bottom dollar, rates for this transport, you were having really honest conversations and saying, hey, one that comes to mind, a patient who had an eye surgery and needed to go over a mountain range in Washington state. But because of their eye surgery, they couldn't go above a certain altitude because of the pressure change. And so we needed to find a transport company who would take like the super long way around with this patient. And fortunately, because there's so many patients in rural Washington, we had this kind of awesome cohort of transportation partners who we could reach out to and say, you know how this works. We take care of you. We understand deadhead miles. We understand these dynamics of things that oftentimes like a bigger traditional broker would be maybe less amenable to. And so we're really driven to get it done for the patients, and we're able to do it in a way that enables the success of the transportation partners as well.
Interesting. I like that story. Sam, what thoughts do you want to leave our NEMT business owning viewers with?
Well, if you are looking for more volume and you happen to be operating in a market where we have customers, certainly reach out to us. You can get onboarded to the platform. You name your rates within reason. We're not going to come negotiate anything with you from a bottom dollar perspective. We've also got tons of data around what the payer mix looks like, what the demand looks like, the times of day, just tons of information about what the demand is for the customers that we're working with. And we're always happy to sit down with folks and kind of look at blinded information and say, hey, here's the trends if you're evaluating entering a market or adding vehicles or staffing changes or whatnot. Like, how do we use the information we have to maximize a transportation partner's success, which in turn maximizes our success. And the ultimate goal is to maximize patient success. So if anyone's interested in working and getting some volume from Roundtrip, we're always happy to have those conversations.
I love it when a broker has that real kind of partnership with a transportation provider and helps them grow. And I will be putting the contact info of Roundtrip in the description of this video. Sam, thank you so much.
Run, Bambi, run!
Perfect. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.